Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2 are games that are synonymous to the Sega Genesis or Sega Mega Drive. Both games became critical and commercial success as collectively they have sold around 6.3 million copies worldwide and contributed around $392 million collectively for Sega as of 1993. The success of the two Streets of Rage games would prompt Sega to create a third installment of the series to finally create a proper trilogy. As we learned from Streets of Rage 2, Sega always wanted to create their games bigger and better with every new installment. It was no different for the next game of the entry, Streets of Rage 3. Sega and the developer company, Ancient Corporation, would find different ways to create a different yet better experience for Streets of Rage 3. 2 years after the release of the second game, Sega released Streets of Rage 3 or Bare Knuckle 3 in Japan. Despite wanting to create a solid third act to close the trilogy, the third game is arguably the most controversial entry. This game is not only controversial in terms of the content it's presenting, it's controversial in terms of players' reception to the overall product. Some players think the game is the worst game of the series. Meanwhile, other players think the game is good with many improvements from the previous entry. After 30 years of the game's release, I still believe that there are more good aspects to Streets of Rage 3 than there are bad. Despite that, I also think that the game could have been done better in certain ways. In retrospect, I think Streets of Rage 3 still deserves more positive reception than simply being an entry that is slept over. Streets of Rage 3 is also the game where it has so many differences with its Japanese counterpart, Bare Knuckle 3. The game also had some planned content that was eventually removed in the final product. In a way, this game is quite messy for the lack of better terms. In this video, we will discuss everything about Streets of Rage 3. From the development to the gameplay aspect and also the differences between regions, we will take a 30-year retrospective of the messy misunderstood masterpiece known as Streets of Rage 3. With the success of Streets of Rage 2, Sega would once again have Ancient Corporation work on Streets of Rage 3. However, interesting enough, despite the major success of the second game, Sega decided not to bring Koshiro Ayano back as the lead designer for the third game. The reason why Sega did not bring her back for the project remains somewhat unclear. According to an interview on Time Extension, Koshiro Ayano even stated that she didn't know why Sega decided not to bring her back. She considered the decision was made out of Sega wanting to produce the game internally without too much outsourcing. It is important to note that despite Ancient Corporation working on Streets of Rage 3, most of the in-game development was done by Sega's own development department at the time. Ancient Corporation's major contribution in the third game was on the music and sound department, as Koshiro Yuzo and Kawashima Motohiro returned for the project. In replace of Koshiro Ayano, the lead designer for Streets of Rage 3 was Seimiya Atsushi. Seimiya is a senior artist at Sega of Japan. Prior to Streets of Rage 3, he worked as a designer for the previous two Streets of Rage games, East SWAT City Under Siege, The Revenge of Shinobi, and Strider. He would later take on the role of lead director for Skies of Arcadia on the Sega Dreamcast. Sega entrusted Seimiya as the lead or total designer for Streets of Rage 3, primarily due to him having experience with the previous two games. For the third game, Seimiya and his team wanted to improve the gameplay style that was built of the previous game. This is something that we will cover in a later chapter of the video. Some interesting trivia to talk about here. Despite Sega's attempt to improve the gameplay mechanics of Streets of Rage 3, Koshiro Ayano stated in the Time Extension interview that the final product is rather shallow. According to Koshiro Ayano, Streets of Rage 3 is not a bad game, but it's not outstandingly good either since it lacks pace and rhythm. Streets of Rage 3 can be assumed to have quite the rough development behind the scenes. This can be seen with how the final product turned out to be. The game has some content that didn't make it to the final version, and it also has a lot of differences between regions. This is something we will discuss further once again in a later chapter. Despite having a completely different development team for the third game, Sega had to give it all to create an even bigger sequel to close this trilogy. Was Sega able to create a worthy successor to Streets of Rage 2? Let's take a deeper look at the in-game quality aspect of Streets of Rage 3. I want to make a personal take here before I talk about the combat mechanics of Streets of Rage 3. I honestly believe Streets of Rage 3 has a better gameplay than Streets of Rage 2. The game was able to improve the combat mechanics of the previous game. The developers did not take away any gameplay aspect of the second game while adding new gameplay mechanics for the third game. Let's recap the combat mechanics. Just like in Streets of Rage 2, this game has 3 main command inputs: A for special, B for attack, and C for jump. Every character can still perform different forms of special attacks, such as defensive special with the A button, offensive special with the D-pad and the A button, and blitz attack with double forward and B button. Now, the special attack with the A button still consumes an amount of health. However, this game allows you to prevent consuming your health when performing the special attack. Do you see the vertical bar next to your health? That is the energy bar. The energy bar gradually increases automatically. When it reaches the maximum level, the word OK will appear on the top of the bar. If you perform a special attack when the word OK is present on the energy bar, you will not consume any amount of health. Streets of Rage 3 introduced an upgrade system for your blitz attack. Do you see the stars below the health bar? Those stars indicate the level of your blitz attack. At maximum, you can collect up to 3 stars. To collect these stars, you simply have to constantly beat up enemies without dying. You can lose a star whenever you die in battle. As you collect more stars, your character blitz attack changes. The more stars you collect, the stronger the blitz attack. Take Axel Stone for example. When he doesn't have any stars, his blitz attack is the ground upper. When he gains 1 star, his blitz attack becomes a stronger version of the ground upper. When he gains 2 stars, his blitz attack changes into a spinning wheel punch. Finally, when he gains 3 stars, his blitz attack becomes a spinning wheel punch followed by a jumping uppercut. I personally think this was a welcomed addition to the game. It brought a lot more depth to the combat mechanics of Streets of Rage 3. It's also an aspect I do believe a lot of players tend to sleep over from the game. Speaking of blitz attack, the game introduced blitz attack with weapons. To perform blitz attack with weapons, you simply have to push double forward and the B button while your character is holding a weapon. Once again, I greatly appreciate the creativity of improvement on this game. Another improvement to the gameplay is the ability to run. In Streets of Rage 2, the only character who can run is Skate Hunter. In Streets of Rage 3, however, every playable character has the ability to run. This might be a minor improvement, but I do love this addition. It makes the game more fast-paced, honestly. The game also introduced dodge rolls. To perform a dodge roll, you simply need to tap up or down on the D-pad twice. However, I do have one major gripe with the gameplay. Streets of Rage 3, in my opinion, has probably the worst boss fights in the entire entry. Most of the fights you can win by cheesing them. Some of the bosses are downright annoying. I'm looking at you, Neo X. Streets of Rage 2 has a good combat mechanics as the developers were able to have the depth of that of a fighting game. Streets of Rage 3, however, improved on the previous combat mechanic, thus giving it more depth. Despite various criticism for the game, the combat mechanics is one of the most overlooked aspects. If anything, I personally believe that Streets of Rage 3 has the best combat mechanics of the entire trilogy. As previously mentioned in the opening of this video, this is the entry where there are so many differences between the Japanese version and the American version. I don't know where to begin honestly with this entry. Alright, let's start from the plot of the game. In Bare Knuckle 3, the story takes place in the year 19XX, An atomic bomb made of an element called Rakushin was detonated in Wood Oak City. The explosion caused 30,000 deaths and 80,000 wounded. This incident was recorded as the worst disaster in history. This part of the story was totally inspired by Fist of the North Star. After the incident, the protagonist of the game, Axel Stone, received a letter from his partner, Blaze Fielding. It is said that the Syndicate may have been responsible for the incident. A military general named Petrov from a fictional country called the Lima Nation was also reported missing after the incident. This could be the Syndicate's plot to start a world war, just so that they can have their revenge on Axel and his friends. Axel Stone, along with Blaze Fielding, Skate Hunter, and a newcomer of the game, Dr. Gilbert Zan, must act swiftly to stop the Syndicate from starting a nuclear war. When you think about it, Mr. X is probably one of the most evil villains in video game history. He wanted to start a nuclear war just so he could get back to Axel for foiling his plans. To call this act petty is a massive understatement. This plot, however, was altered in the American version of the game. In Streets of Rage 3, the Syndicate plans to replace all city officials with robots. While doing so, the Syndicate has placed bombs all over the city to divert the attention of the police. Axel and his friends must quickly find these bombs and expose the Syndicate's plan to stop them once and for all. The change in plot for the American version was most likely because it was too heavy of a topic for a video game. Bear in mind that the stigma of video games was that they were merely toys for children, specifically in the United States at the time. Especially during a time where the ESRB was just established to regulate content in video games. Parents' concern in regards to mature content in video games was at an all-time high. On a personal note, I do like the story for Bare Knuckle 3. It creates a darker and grittier atmosphere to the series, something that once again, a lot of people seems to underappreciate. But that's just how I feel. The game experienced some graphic changes as well. For start, the playable characters had their color changed. As you can see here, Axel, Blaze, and Skate had their color palette changed from Bare Knuckle 3 to Streets of Rage 3. Zan is the only character that kept his color palette. I'm not sure why this particular change was made, and I still find it really weird. These three characters in Bare Knuckle 3 have the same color palettes in Streets of Rage 2. What's the point of changing their iconic color palettes in Streets of Rage 3? Some enemies got their design reworked as well. The female enemies in the game, Electra and Garnet, had their sprites reworked. As you can see here, in Bare Knuckle 3, they wear more revealing outfits. In Streets of Rage 3, these girls had to cover themselves more. Once again, this was probably done to tone down the sex appeal as it may considered to be inappropriate content. Basically, Sega did not want to deal with any headaches distributing the game in America, especially with the newly established ESRB. Speaking of inappropriate content, Bare Knuckle 3 has an infamous mini-boss that was removed in Streets of Rage 3. That mini-boss is Ash, who is portrayed as a stereotypical homosexual deviant. His removal is self-explanatory, honestly. Parents would be fuming if Sega actually allowed this character to be distributed in the American version. To be fair though, Ash would also not fly in today's day and age, for possibly different reasons, so to speak. Ash is seen on the first stage of Bare Knuckle 3 carrying goons on a speedboat. In Streets of Rage 3, he was replaced by Shiva, who is also the boss of the first stage. Streets of Rage 3 had an increase of difficulty levels compared to Bare Knuckle 3. The easy mode of the Western version is the equivalent of normal mode for the Japanese version, and the normal mode for the Western version is the equivalent of hard mode for the Japanese version. The Western version of the game also prevents players from proceeding beyond stage 5 on easy mode. So if you want to get one of the true endings of the game, you have to play Streets of Rage 3 on normal, which is quite hard by the way. I'm not sure why Sega made the Western release more difficult. However, there are theories that it was due to the rental market in the United States at the time. The game amped up the difficulty so that players who rent the game couldn't complete it. Once again, I'm not really sure about this. I never rent a game back in the day, and I am not an American. There are more regional differences of the game than the ones I have mentioned. I'm going to stop here, however, because I can go forever talking about every single one of them. If you want to learn more details about the regional differences, you can read them at tcrf.net. Link is in the description below. With all the regional differences, I will say Bare Knuckle 3 is the superior version. This mainly because I find the game to be more balanced in terms of difficulty. Not to mention, it's the version that was intended from the beginning. But that is just my opinion at the end of the day. Streets of Rage 3 offers a branching path storyline unlike the previous games. The first Streets of Rage has 2 different endings, but you play all of the same 8 stages from start to finish. Streets of Rage 2, on the other hand, has a linear storyline with 8 stages and 1 ending. Streets of Rage 3 has 7 stages where you have 2 different 7th stage and a total of 4 different endings. The first ending is the easy mode ending, which is only present in the Western release of the game. Once you defeated Robot X on easy mode, you get an unresolved ending. It is hinted in the ending that Mr. X is somewhere alive watching you. You will have the words "The End" on the screen as you see Mr. X crushing a glass of wine with his right hand. The second ending is the unresolved ending. In stage 6, there is a mission where you have to save General Petrov before the timer runs out. To unlock this ending, you need to let the timer run out and General Petrov dies from poison. This leads you to the City Hall for stage 7 and you fight a stronger Shiva as the final boss. Once Shiva is defeated, you will have the same ending as the easy mode ending where Mr. X is watching you with the words "The End" appearing on screen. The third ending is the disaster ending. In stage 6, you must save General Petrov before the timer runs out. After you defeat the boss in the stage, Adam picks you up with a helicopter and you travel to a hidden robot facility in the forest. At the end of the stage, you finally meet Mr. X as he is nothing more than a brain. Mr. X will start a countdown to detonate Rakushin bombs in various points. You will fight Robo Y or Neo X in the Japanese version as the timer goes down. To get the disaster ending, you simply have to beat the final boss after the timer expires. In this ending, despite defeating Mr. X, Wood Oak City is completely destroyed with many people killed. The fourth ending is the best ending. To unlock this ending, you need to go over the same procedure as the disaster ending, however, you must defeat the final boss before the timer runs up. In this ending, Axel and his friends finally ended Mr. X for good and saved the city from total destruction. I absolutely love this concept. It adds more replay value to the somewhat simple genre. It's a shame honestly that this is the only time in the series where branching storyline was applied. This concept did not make a return in the next official game, Streets of Rage 4. However, this concept was applied to the amazing fan-made game called Streets of Rage Remake. By default, the game allows you to pick between 4 characters. Returning from Streets of Rage 2, we have Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding, and Skate Hunter. In replace of Max Thunder, we are introduced to Dr. Gilbert Zan, who is a cyborg scientist that is responsible for the discovery of the Rakushin element. Streets of Rage 3 was the first game in the series to have unlockable characters. There are 3 unlockable characters in which one of them is only in the Japanese version. The first hidden character is a kangaroo named Ru, or Victi in the Japanese version. There are 2 ways to unlock him. The first method, you simply have to hold up on the D-pad and the B button during the title screen, then press start. You now have the ability to select Ru from the selection screen. The second method is to not defeat him when you encounter him in stage 2. You will fight Ru and his ringmaster, Bruce or Danch in the Japanese version. Defeat Bruce without defeating Ru, thus Ru is selectable in the continue screen. The second hidden character is Shiva. On last video, we talked about Koshiro Ayano wanting to have Shiva as a playable character in Streets of Rage 2. Well, he is finally playable in Streets of Rage 3. To unlock him, you simply need to hold the B button and the start button together after you defeat him in stage 1. Shiva will be selectable in the continue screen. The last hidden character is the removed mini-boss from Bare Knuckle 3, Ash. To unlock Ash, you just need to defeat him in stage 1, then hold the A button. Just like the rest of the hidden characters, you can select Ash in the continue screen. Having to unlock characters in Streets of Rage 3 was a welcomed feature in the series. This is a feature that, once again, has been overlooked by a lot of players of the series. Originally, Streets of Rage 3 intended to have a motorbiking stage. I'm not sure why this segment was removed, but from what I have gathered so far, it's probably due to time constraint during development. Sega needed to release the game before the motorbiking stage was even properly polished. In the end, they decided to scrap this segment altogether from the final product. Footage of the planned motorbiking stage can be found on a Japanese Sega VHS of December 1993 for Bare Knuckle 3 Beta.
もちろんメインの格闘の間にはこのようなサブゲームも用意されている。あらゆる楽しさが凝縮されたソフトだよね。
Another screenshot shows a different stage for the motorbiking session. This screenshot was taken from an Australian magazine called Hyper, issue 007. On a different note, the fan-made game, Streets of Rage Remake, allows you to experience the intended motorbiking stages in full force. I really encourage you guys to try out Streets of Rage Remake with the latest version, version 5.2. That is also a game I will be covering more in depth in a future video. Despite being a cancelled content for Streets of Rage 3, it does shows that the developers wanted to make this entry a spectacular one. They really had the mentality of constantly improving the series by consistently trying to add new concept to each coming entry. A shame that some of them weren't able to be realized in the final product. The music for Streets of Rage 3 is probably the most controversial aspect of the entire game. Many fans of the series claim that this game has the worst music in the entire series. Honestly, I was in that boat too. Some who said that Streets of Rage 3 is the worst entry in the series claim that the music is the main reason. Perhaps the music might not be as amazing as the previous entries, but calling the game the worst or even terrible just from one aspect is a bit of a stretch. According to an interview by shmuplations.com, Kawashima Motohiro was behind most of the music's writing for Streets of Rage 3. According to Kawashima in the interview, he stated that he wanted to experiment more on what he can do with the Mega Drive MIDI. He didn't want to make another Streets of Rage 2 style music for the game. He even stated that he might be a bit crazy for doing so. Even in the interview, Kawashima and Koshiro acknowledged that some may think the music for Streets of Rage 3 is the worst. However, they wanted to create the music they want for the game and didn't hold anything back. At the end of the day, both Kawashima and Koshiro stick to their guts on what they want despite the criticism. I have grown to appreciate the music for Streets of Rage 3 as time goes by. If anything, I think the style of music fits well with the darker atmosphere of the game. Though a lot of the soundtracks are not my favorites in the series, but some of them I do enjoy. Here are the few tracks that I really like from the game. Streets of Rage 3 is considered by some as the weakest entry in the series. Most of the complaints, however, came from the alteration of the Western release and the underwhelming music of the game. However, I find it to be really strange. I don't think Streets of Rage 3 is a bad game because of the underwhelming music. If anything, I think Streets of Rage 3 is the best of the trilogy, despite the music being worse compared to the first two entries. But evaluating an entire game from one aspect alone is really unfair. The game did a lot of things right, such as improving the combat mechanics, unlockable hidden characters, branching storylines, and other aspects. Ignoring all the quality changes just because of the in-game music is a skewed way of thinking, in my opinion. There are more things the game did right than wrong. I will admit that the Western version of the game did not give the best of impressions. The way I feel about Streets of Rage 3 and Bare Knuckle 3 is the same way I feel about Devil Kings and Sengoku Basara. The alteration Capcom did to Devil Kings really butchered the game to the point where it gave a bad impression of the original Sengoku Basara, so I suggest people to just stick to Sengoku Basara to have a better view of the game and the series. The same can be said about Streets of Rage 3. Just go play Bare Knuckle 3. Despite the criticism, Streets of Rage 3 was able to sell around 3.5 million copies worldwide in 1994. The game earned an estimated gross revenue of $250 million in 1994. The game was still a commercial success for the Sega Mega Drive. With the release of Streets of Rage 3, the series came to a close. Or so we thought. 26 years after the release of Streets of Rage 3, a sequel finally came called Streets of Rage 4. It took us around 4 generations of consoles to finally have Streets of Rage 4. That is a game that will be covered in a future video. During the time between Streets of Rage 3 and Streets of Rage 4, a group of fan developers in Spain called Bomber Games released Streets of Rage Remake in 2011. The game combines everything that is good from the original trilogy to create one amazing experience. The game had the latest update back in 2021. That is also a game to be covered in a future video. So that's it for this in-depth coverage of Streets of Rage 3. What do you think about the game? Do you think this is the best entry of the series? Or do you think this is the worst entry of the series? Let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, this is me, Profar. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you dislike this video, give me a thumbs down. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, join the Profar Mokoi Hunter X Discord server. I'll see you guys in the next video.